Okay, great. So we're going to start off. I'm going to unmute you, Dugan, so that you can tell us a little bit about what this event is. But first, Talita, do you want to talk to us about what the gLOCAL events are?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So as we all know that monitoring and evaluation plays a critical role in strengthening accountability and increasing transparencies in the area of public spending and service delivery. So in this context, sharing global and local M&E knowledge and experience are essential to strengthening local M&E capacity and just to foster accountability for results and to promote evidence-based decision-making and also learn from the results. So these goals are really central to the initiative's mission and therefore the inspiration for Local Evaluation Week. Local evaluation, if I were to explain what it is really, it's convened by the initiative in association with local, regional, and also global partners around the world. This is held annually, this being our very second year running, and organizers around the world are participating as we speak. They are supported by the regional centers who are helping them organize this events virtually as we are right now in the pandemic, to foster a dialogue on M&E practices and issues that are relevant to the local context. So the inspiration for Local Evaluation Week it comes from the acknowledgement of two forces really, and that is the shaping the space evaluation landscape where global knowledge informs local evaluation practices and local experience influence global evaluation thinking. And so our objective was really to raise awareness and promote knowledge and sharing on M&E practices and trends with the final goal of increasing the use of evidence to improve public policies and programs, and really to also strengthen the country and regional level M&E networks that we work in, and to involve everyone, policymakers, civil society, organizations, academics, students, and of course you, the practitioners. And I guess at the end of the day, what we want to do, we don't just want to walk away here with just having had a conversation and then we meet again at the next gLOCAL, but to really produce something tangible that not only would help us as GAA, but will help you as well, as I'm sure we all are gearing towards a common goal.
Thank you. Thanks, Talita, for giving us that background on what gLOCAL is. And I'm going to hand over to you, Dugan, now, because we have some objectives for this wider event that I wanted you to talk us through a little bit.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the call. I'm going to be super brief because there's a lot of content coming your way. As Talita said, CLEAR is committed to building monitoring and evaluation systems that generate good evidence for data use. Good evidence for decision making. And what the COVID-19 lockdown experience has made so incredibly visible to everybody is the role that the online domain is going to be playing, and data, privacy, confidentiality. These are big strategic questions that we're going to be facing increasingly over the long term. So our partnership with MERL-tech is about trying to put together a coalition or an alliance of people that work on these issues. And we're looking forward to hearing what people think, but our long-term goal is to be putting in place a process that's going to lead to the adoption of a set of guidelines or good practices, or maybe even some kind of charter that people can use to help frame the ways in which they operate in the digital space. And as you can imagine, that will be a long-term endeavor, but we understand that even just by having these conversations, we can help infuse certain values and certain principles. And we can start getting a conversation going that appreciates what the dangers are and can start bringing participation and inclusion into the front of people's minds in a way that respects privacy, makes sure that we don't take advantage of people, that we don't get monetized and commoditized in ways that we understand to be the big challenges of the future. So while this conversation is one of 3 conversations, we're hoping it's going to be a starting point for a broader, longer-term engagement. So you haven't heard the last of this, and we're looking forward to your participation, and we're very grateful to the people who are speaking on this call, and especially to Linda for curating and acting as a convener. And I'm looking forward to everybody's contributions. Thank you very much, Linda.
Thanks, Dugan. And MERL-tech, just very quickly, is a network of evaluators, researchers, technology companies, developers, funders, a really wide network of folks that are all working on what is the intersection of monitoring, evaluation, research and learning, and technology and digital data. So we've been trying to get people together for the last several years to kind of explore these questions and to really bring a lens, an ethical lens, a responsibility lens into the way that we're thinking about how we collect and how we use data. And then how we use some of the new tools that are coming out, mobile data collection. There's just so many new ways that technology is integrating into evaluation, into research, into monitoring, that we wanted to have a really broad discussion around that. So that's really what MERL-tech is about. And we're also very excited to be collaborating with Clear AA on this series of events. So the next thing we're going to do is get right into our speakers. As I mentioned, we have Korstian from Genesis Analytics, we have Jerusha from Data Innovators, and we have Teki from the African Digital Rights Hub. I'm going to turn the slides off now so that you can really engage with the speakers, I think, and see what Korstian has to tell us. I'll unmute you now, Korstian, and I will hand right over to you. Let me just get my slides off the screen, and then we'll get going. Whoops. Okay. Unmuted.
Is that it?
Good. There we go. Yep.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So, as mentioned, my name is Korstian. I'm with a company called Genesis Analytics with a Center of Digital Excellence. So very happy to be here. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to use this opportunity to firstly present what I've playfully termed a diagnostic of our current state of affairs as it relates to the data ecosystem, to point out where there are areas of challenge or frictions that induce the need for more responsible practices and processes. So I identify different players, different channels, to really just broaden the context around how we think about the concept of data ecosystems, of data responsibility. And so I hope that this provides a nice landing strip for my fellow panelists, but also to point out the fact that when we think about responsibility in data, that there's responsibility in data in terms of process around how data is acquired, how it is stored, how it is managed, how personal data is protected. There is responsibility in terms of how it's analyzed and how it's presented. But the concept of responsibility can also dig quite deep right down to the individual, which is how do we think about responsibility right down to the level of how we as individuals consume data and share it in our social circles. So to broaden the landscape a little bit along those lines. So what I think the COVID-19 genuine crises do is they create an immense sense of uncertainty, mass uncertainty. And individuals are left with trying to source some sort of information to guide their feelings, to understand what is going on in their local environment, global context, to really just try to gauge how they should feel and how they should act or behave. And a critical piece of this information is, of course, data. And I think data has got a very special place in people's hearts as it relates to information. It's considered to be fact. If it's got decimals, it's considered to be highly accurate. And so it really is the top tier of what we consider information. And so we have this circumstance where people are uncertain about the future and are hunting for some sort of guidance, especially through digital channels. And so people are hunting through digital channels, they're trying to find out some sort of information or what's going on. But the backdrop of this is, I think that there's a tendency as a society, with all this bombardment of information that we have, to not dig quite as deep as we should into what we're reading. And so there's a tendency towards reading headlines as opposed to articles. And so we scrape the surface of these immense pools of information, and generally, I think in many circumstances, come out with some sort of or suboptimal understanding of the current situation. So there's this enormous demand for data and for information. And if we then turn our eyes towards the supply side of who is providing this, I think there are three key stakeholders that we can look at. And so I think the first is the journalistic cohort. These are the entities and the institutions that take information that's made available and try to present it in a digestible way. And through the period of this crisis, I think we've seen that in a number of instances, numbers and data is cherry-picked, and that in a number of instances, journalists are not quite to the level of their analytical capabilities to really consolidate this information, disseminate it in a digestible way, which speaks to the need to tool your reader and to equip them with the capacity to interpret the information and subsequently make a reasonable and rational decision around that. I think the second cohort is the research and academic community. And of course, wrapped around this community is this very powerful concept that we all adore, which is academic rigor, which provides us some sort of confidence that the findings of these academics and researchers are trustworthy. They've taken steps to ensure that their models are unbiased, that they've catered for suboptimal or subpar quality. But we've also seen that a number of these models are extremely flawed. And so at the basis of that, there's these academics are being pushed to try and resolve a great social tension. But on the layer of that as well, is there's the opportunity for prestige. And so when we look at the concept of data responsibility, there's also the need to look at individuals' own objectives and their biases, and how that forms into how we communicate and how we analyze data. And so then the third cluster, I suppose one might call, is of course the political cluster, who are charged with the responsibility of informing the public and trying to rationalize or communicate why certain decisions have been made. And I sense in many contexts that the way information is communicated can be one-sided, and that is communicated in a way to meet a certain agenda or communicate the rationale behind a certain decision. And so if we look at these three channels for information, we sense that in many instances there's the risk of bias, and that there's the risk of cherry-picking numbers that meet certain objectives. And that increasingly what we see is, for example, when there's a confidence interval around a certain projection, that the top end of the more risky end of the confidence interval is communicated and shared. And so through these three channels, of course, at the back end of those channels are concerns of the quality of data that is informing those interpretations in the first place. So we know that there are gaps in data quality acquired from the hospitals and various other sources. So when we conduct a diagnostic in that sense, we've got this immense demand for data and information, and the supply of information is not necessarily meeting the standards that it should be. And so that creates the risk of misinformation and of flawed understandings. And so in this peculiar space, we talk about data. Data's got a peculiar role in this space, because the presentation of a figure as a fact is correct, but it requires context and additional information around it to make sense of it. And so even the presentation of a figure accurately, if not provided with context, is nonsensical, can be nonsensical. And so at Genesis Analytics, we were engaging with this process, and we were thinking about this while we were developing and designing a number of monitoring and analytical tools. And we were thinking about how to do so responsibly and how to do so in a way that delivers the correct message, but also empowers the user with the information necessary to digest it and understand it. And so we devised three very high-level principles, which I won't go into too much depth. I think my fellow panelists have got more detail on this, but just as a high level, embrace uncertainty and the limitations of the science, which is essentially accepting the fact that what is available might not necessarily be the whole truth, and we're still figuring that out. Provide context and the tools needed for interpretation. So this is something around providing definitions, providing a little bit more oversight around sources. Be front-footed in identifying and sharing limitations of the numbers. I think this is incredibly important, which is something along the lines of what assumptions underpin these models, and what assumptions underpin the data acquisition techniques. And so I think these are three very powerful and important principles when we look at the roles and responsibilities of those people that disseminate information, the journalists and the academics and the politicians. But I think there's the room for opportunity, or the opportunity to expand that thinking a little bit further, because these principles are being deployed to guard individuals and to empower individuals. So how can we think about how we empower individuals to make those decisions themselves? So how do we improve an individual's capacity to identify a high quality source versus a low quality source? How do we promote the value of fact checking and cross-validating information when we're presented with it? And for myself, I think this is an incredibly important activity, because through time, people will only be exposed to more information and more data. And there's only so much that we can do in terms of the layer of how we filter information and data through to other people. And really at the base of it, where data is communicated most, is the individual. So I think there's room to really expand the thinking to how do we empower those people at the base ourselves as a society. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christian. It was a really interesting overview to kind of help us think about this big picture of the importance of data and the need to really think through very clearly what the repercussions can be of the way that we collect, share, and use data in our work. Our next speaker is Jerusha, and she is going to talk to us a lot about this angle of responsible data use when we're thinking about data visualization. Let me just unmute you, Jerusha, and you can.
Okay, I'm unmuted, I think.
You're unmuted. Okay, great. Go ahead.
Good, thanks. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so as Linda mentioned, I'm Jerusha Govender, and I'm from a small business based in Johannesburg, South Africa, called Data Innovator. And data communication, or telling stories with data, is one of my personal interests. And it's really the angle of the conversation that I want to start off with you all, and really talking about what is responsible data visualization or data communication, and what is its relevance in the context of COVID. And when I thought about this, I looked at it from unpacking it from two angles. And the first, which is a lot of what Christian has already shared with you, is from a very technical perspective. What is responsible data viz? How do we do responsible data viz? And then the second angle is from the human and more ethical considerations angle. And so to start with, what does it mean from a technical perspective? We know that it's really important to make sure that when you're presenting your data, that before presenting it, you've considered all the dimensions of data quality, because we know that without this, we're probably presenting an incomplete picture. But even with the right quality of the data, this sometimes is not sufficient to inform the right decisions, that we also need the contextual information and even some kind of guidance or guidance on how to interpret the data to make sure that when it's disseminated or presented, the user of it is extracting the data in the appropriate way and is making sense of it in the way that it should be used at different levels. Is the consumer making sense of it from a community perspective, a provincial perspective, a country perspective, or we providing limited information in order to do that? And so I want to refer to this really popularized flattening the curve chart, which I assume most of you have seen a version of this. There have been multiple versions of these going on social media and in the news. And I think that never before have I observed globally that we've engaged with data or chart in the way we did with the COVID flattening the curve chart. And I think that was great, that it really opened the public up to interrogate data or access data. But at the same time, there are some risks with presenting information in such a way, because what we were seeing with the flattening the curve is that we had the single data model that was shared globally, and it was meant to be supporting or helping possibly inform national level strategy. But there are so many underlying things that were not shared with it. For example, we're presenting the trend in cases, but what does a case mean? Actually, a case is based on test rates. What are the test rates in different countries? How would this curve look differently? What does that mean for how I then use it for national strategy? And there are various other underlying indicators that were not always presented with it. For example, perhaps like the health worker to patient ratios. How does that influence how we deal with this flattening the curve? What are some of the comorbidity data that should be presented with it? And there are multiple other factors as well. So then even at a more personal level, I think already we see that there are some limitations with how it was presented. At the personal level, this information was shared to not only the technical researcher, but the everyday person, the lay person, who was also engaging with this information on Twitter or Facebook or whatever other platform they accessed it. But what does that message then, by looking at the curve, flattening the curve, mean for that individual? Because with a lot of these, the charts that were shared, the messages that were disseminated was around flattening the curve, stay at home. But what does that mean for an individual who is from a township living in a shack with a household of more than 6 individuals, just as an example? What kind of behavior do we expect to change in that individual, or how do we anticipate that individual will receive that kind of messaging? Do we need to unpack it in a way that makes sense for that person and not just for kind of a global message for every person? And so this brings me to the more human angle, which is really important in responsible data visualization, is that we need to remember that as much as our data is often generated in a technical manner by the evaluator or data specialist, we often stop at that point of presenting it as if we're presenting it to our colleague. But in the same way we use like human-centered design in developing digital products, we should see our data visualization as a digital product. Who are other consumers of this, and how do they need to engage with it? So that we don't stop at presenting data in a technical manner for the general public, but finding ways that it's packaged in a way that if we intend for them to be more informed or change a behavior, we've provided the relevant context, the relevant design, so that that individual can engage with it in that way. And so, as I said, COVID Live has really spiked the engagement with data, but also just the engagement with media and news and social media. So we need to, as data producers, really need to challenge ourselves in thinking about how we're being more sensitive and in how we're putting out information on social media, so that it's not presented only for the technical specialist, but the layperson as well. And there are a couple of ways we can do this, or making some adjustments in how we present data. And often it's just in the visual elements of our data visualization, things like color, the shapes we use, the scale of things, the headliners we provide. All of these evoke, sometimes they are used to evoke drama, when actually it should be used to inform or guide an individual. And I've seen a lot of this, for example, recently, because of the high rate of COVID cases in the Western Cape. There was a map that was presented and it had these big red bubbles all over. And when somebody from the general public sees this, the way it's presented evokes more fear than wanting me to engage and understand, why is this, why is it differently? So I think it's really important that we think about what is it that we're putting out there, and how would the general public actually perceive this? Am I creating unnecessary drama or unnecessary stress? Am I achieving the purpose of the data itself? And how can I change that? And I think we've seen that through COVID, it's really shown us the value of presenting data to the public and the risks in presenting it. And it's really important that we consider the visual aspects of it and the content that we are presenting with that, to make sure that we're not generating fear or misinformation, but we're communicating data really well. And I think I also put it out as a challenge that as technical people, we start thinking about a more human-centered angle to data visualization and think about what are some of the best practices and guidelines to do this right. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jerusha. I think that that really kind of pulls it into perspective of what it means in the way that we present data and how people are interpreting it and how they're able to make decisions based on the things that they're presented with, and kind of the responsibility that anyone who is creating data sets, data sources, and data visualizations needs to think through a lot of those ethical and responsibility issues. Our third speaker today is Teki. She's going to speak to us about some of the political angles instead of the legal angles around responsible data collection and use. So I will pass over to you, Teki.
Yes, thank you, Linda, and thank you for this opportunity. It's raining heavily here, so just pardon the noise if you can hear a bit of noise in the background. So from where I sit, there is an even stronger call for responsible collection and use of data during this pandemic. If for nothing at all, we are actually seeing the clear evidence of, the possibility of stigmatization. We're seeing the evidence of, how inappropriate collection and use of such data affects human dignity. Now, we need information, and there's no two ways about that. We need the data. But it is very important that we pay attention to the fact that that need should not override key principles, ethical and legal principles in terms of how such data is collected and handled. Now, what are some of the questions we should ask ourselves if we want to collect and use these data critically? Are we being transparent enough, about our processes of collection, about our processes of using the data, and about our intention of what the information will be used for eventually? Are we collecting just what we need, or we are hanging? Everybody now recognizes the fact that data is the new oil. So there is that tendency for whether be they governments, be they private sector, or all parties and stakeholders in this space to take advantage of this situation to amass large amounts of data. Now, the worrying part for me in all this is that, especially when you're looking at some of the critical things we need to do around the COVID pandemic, such as contact tracing and the like, we're collecting highly sensitive health data. And this data is typically supposed to be handled with, a lot of care and with the consent of the data subjects. We see governments, we see individuals hiding under the notion of health and safety reasons, which is a legitimate reason, and collecting these data, but refusing to adhere to the protocols that are necessary to keep the data secure. At the end of the day, people are scared. And the fact that people are scared is also a reason for us to be worried about the quality of the kind of data that we are even collecting, especially when you're looking at some of these COVID and contact tracing apps. Are people providing the accurate and quality set of data to enable us make informed decisions which will benefit the whole of society? And if they are not, what are the real questions that we are not asking? Are we providing enough oversight over how the data is collected and used? Who is there watching over whether they are technology corporations, whether it's a government entity, whether it's a health facility, or even an individual? Who is there watching them to make sure that they are doing the right thing? And if nobody is even watching over them, do they feel ethically responsible enough in the interest of the dignity of all human beings to collect and handle this information in a way that does not prejudice people after the pandemic? And so for me, responsible use of data during the COVID entails a number of factors that all of us that are playing any role in collection and use of data have a huge responsibility. We must all recognize that we are all playing a role in this. Whether I am even just an individual providing an information for the space, or a third party that is processing such information in the larger interest of society, or I'm a government agency that is trying to manage the fallouts of lockdowns and other issues that affect my country, it is important that all of us bear in mind that we have a responsibility. And what is that responsibility? That responsibility is to make sure that we are collecting as minimal information as possible. What do we need in the first place? So we just take enough information that we need. When we are collecting the information, we should make sure that we are putting in place the necessary protocols around the retention period for that information, and around the security of that information, to make sure that it doesn't go into the wrong hands. If we have to necessarily share the information for other decision-making processes, we must also make sure that we're only sharing what is necessary, with other third parties to enable them take that informed decision. For governments and other third parties, it's very important to put in some level of checks and balance. And I believe this can be achieved by being very transparent about the processes that you're engaging in. And then also, to a large extent, if there is a data protection regulator or some other form of oversight, we should ensure that there is, a level of oversight over our practices, so that at the end of the day, we are not just saying that we are doing things right, but we can clearly open our books to a third party to come and assess and verify that what we are doing is right. And I think that even the individuals that are sharing their information, also have a right to ask more questions about, what the information is going to be used for, how it's being processed, and to raise questions when they feel uncomfortable about it. Yes, so that will be all for me, in terms of looking at what responsible data collection and use will be during this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Teki. I think that was a really great overview of what some of the legal and sort of privacy implications are when we're collecting data, especially very sensitive health data during the COVID crisis. And I think as the crisis moves on, we're also going to be seeing other kinds of sensitive data that, because we know it's not only a health crisis, it's also going to be an economic crisis. And we don't really even know what some of the long-term fallouts might be from what's happening with COVID. So I think that was a really great overview of some of the issues we're thinking about in terms of data responsibility, in terms of how we need to take a very active role as an evaluation, as a monitoring, as a research learning communities, to really take care of the data that we're collecting, especially when we're collecting it on quite vulnerable populations, making sure that we're taking that all the way through the data life cycle in a very clear, consistent, and responsible way. So I really appreciate those insights from all of our speakers.